Labs over Fabs, why the US and Europe should invest in the future of semiconductors. To discuss, we have on one of the two co-authors of my report entitled Labs over Fab, Chris Miller, professor at Tufts University, and Jan-Pieter Kleinens, who is the
Project Director, Technology and Geopolitics at SNV,
which is a
Berlin-based think tank for tech policy.
Awesome.
So Chris, when I read Labs over Fabs, my first thought was, why did you have the impulse after during the time of Chips for America Act and so much policy attention, the semiconductor space finally, and the need for industrial policy in the US, why did you have the urge to say, wait a minute, why don't we focus on this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think we thought hard about the title of the report, and we titled it not Labs, not Fabs, but rather Labs over Fabs. Because we're not trying to say that fabs aren't important. Obviously they are. There's a really strong argument trying to incentivize and encourage fab production. We've already seen after TSMC's announcement that it's going to build in Arizona, a number of its suppliers also announcing they're going to build nearby. But it's a question of marginal dollars. If you've got a $1 billion or $50 billion to spend, where is that going to go the furthest? And that's where when you start thinking about what does $1 billion worth of subsidies for fabs get you versus what does $1 billion of subsidies versus something else get you? It seemed to us there was a lot of scope for asking that question and trying to think through what the answer was.
Yeah. So just to set the scene, basically the CHIPS Act, which is now in the broader competition package, we're recording this on May 26th. Most of the money seems to be going towards subsidies for fab construction in the U.S. The impetus being, I guess, U.S.-China competition, folks being scared of the chip shortage, and large fabs being excited about the billions and billions of dollars potentially coming their way. So all this kind of combined to have most of the money, though not all of the money in the current legislation, going towards subsidies for fab construction, as opposed to the other ideas that both of us will be talking about over the next 45 minutes or so.
Maybe as a follow-up to this regarding what your urge was, why do you think there is so much focus on the fabrication side? Because if we look at the value chain, the US is completely dominating the chip design area. The chip design is the part with the highest value add across the entire value chain. It's actually the production step where you define technology, right? TSMC in Taiwan is producing chips for Apple that Apple designed. So Apple defined the technology and shaped it. So in my opinion, this is the much more interesting process step and the much more aspiring production step to have in your own industry. So why do you think, at least from the US policy perspective, why are the policy makers so focused on subsidizing, like Jordan, you mentioned before, and building fabs instead of subsidizing and investing in a stronger chip design ecosystem?
I think there are a couple of potential answers to this, probably a bit of truth in all of them. There's a cynical political explanation, which is that there's a couple of pretty influential senators and representatives, including the Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who have got pretty big facilities in their states or districts, and I think pretty understandably imagine that political calculations are shaping their views. That's part of the story. It's not the whole story. I think another big part of the story is if you look across the supply chain, you're right to say that on the design side, America has a really substantial role. In the equipment space, there's a substantial role played by American firms. But in fabrication, the U.S. and the rest of the world is very reliant on one company on one small island off of China's coast. And so there's the risk of earthquakes, there's the risk of droughts, there's the risk of geopolitics all getting in the way. And I think that's been a big factor in the push towards more support for fabrication onshore, or at least in different places other than Taiwan. And the question, of course, is, well, if we were to spend $50 billion on that, how much additional fabrication would it actually get us? And I think what's really interesting is if you look at the semiconductor industry, the SAA's report with BCG on this topic, they actually say you don't get that much more fabrication with $50 billion of incentives. You change the balance a couple of percent.
Let's throw this one back at you, JP. Why are the Europeans so focused on building fabs when their leadings are even further behind where Intel is relative to the Samsungs and TSMCs of the world?
Yeah, absolutely. To put it into perspective, the most advanced fab in Europe is actually Intel's in Ireland. And then the next available foundry, so contract chip making, is Global Foundries, another US company, US origin, not necessarily US owned company, in Dresden with 22 nanometers. So Europe is quite a bit behind without sounding too snarky, but I think it's a question of pride. I think that a little bit of European arrogance to say we didn't invest anything for the past 20 years, but it shouldn't be too hard to catch up to 2 nanometers if we just scrape together 20 billion euros and build this damn fab. This is partly why I like the Labs over Fabs report so much, because I think you make a viable point that instead of focusing on this money grave, which is cutting edge wafer fabrication, you could do so many things with the amount of subsidies that we are talking about. Pat Gelsinger, the CEO of Intel, met with Thierry Breton, our commissioner for the single market in Europe. And apparently he told them the price tag, look, Intel is happy to build it if there are 8 billion euros of subsidy. And you can do a lot with 8 billion euros to strengthen your chip design ecosystem, which is absolutely non-existent in Europe.
And chip design, I think, is over half of the value chain. The money that companies earn from making chips is mostly in the design process. So, JP, let's do a little bit of background. What is chip design, and why does Europe only comprise 2% of the accumulated R&D costs of fabless firms over the past?
There we have to differentiate between the business model and the process step. So of course we have companies such as Infineon or NXP or STMicroelectronics in Europe who do a lot of chip design, right? But as an IDM, as an integrated device manufacturer, these companies, they design their own chips, and for the most part, they also manufacture their own chips. But they are focused on chips that don't necessarily benefit from the most advanced, the most cutting edge manufacturing. If you talk about the charging circuit in your iPhone to charge your battery, or if you talk about the electric vehicle that needs a whole lot of semiconductors, then typically in these areas, you don't need the 5 nanometer, the 7 nanometer, the 2 nanometer wafer fabrication. But you're totally fine to run it on 20 nanometers, on 40 nanometers, on 90 nanometers, on different materials even. And that's what the European players focus on. They focus on the niche that they are really strong at: automotive semiconductors, power semiconductors, sensors, all these kind of things. In this area, you really don't rely on cutting edge wafer fabrication. And that's why, even though European industry is still strong in certain niche markets, we don't really have a competitor to NVIDIA or a competitor to AMD or a competitor to Qualcomm in Europe. Because over time, European semiconductor companies slowly moved out of the consumer business. And the consumer business is really where you have the economies of scale, the volume that you need in order to design and then to manufacture the most advanced chips. Apple, in the fourth quarter of 2020, Apple sold iPhones worth 65 billion US dollars. If I sell 65 billion US dollars worth of iPhones in a single quarter, I can totally invest a couple of billion in designing my own chip and manufacturing it. No problem at all. But there are just very few markets that have similar economies of scale and volumes. And if you're not active in these markets, basically cutting edge chip design and manufacturing is out of your league. It's really out of your reach.
And even though you're supplying to Bosch and making somewhat cool automotive chips, this is not where the real cutting edge is, and it leads you down a path of consolidation and a lower equilibrium than you might have had you been pushing to do the consumer stuff throughout the 2000s.
Exactly. I think consumer stuff is really the keyword here, because outside of consumer electronics, you simply don't have the necessary volumes to justify the huge investments in chip design, in manufacturing that are necessary to produce something at 7 or 5 nanometers. That's in itself why I think the majority of what you wrote in Lab over Fabs would actually be completely applicable to Europe as well, because Europe, while I can see the argument in the US where you can say, look, we already have chip design. We have highly competitive market-leading chip design companies in the US. We just lack the manufacturing. So why don't we invest in manufacturing? Fair enough. But Europe doesn't even have the chip design part. It's building windmills without cornfields. It really doesn't make sense. That was a nice analogy.
Wait,
I trained long for this.
What do windmills do for cornfields? You mill the corn?
For flour, exactly. It's antique technology, but it's still relevant.
See in America, with our fancy design firms, I'm a few industrial revolutions past those sorts.
That's
of
okay. We can bring it down to European levels.
But JP, I guess the other question for Europe that's interesting is one of the ways that Europe specialized is in lithography with ASML, but it's not only ASML, it's a lot of ASML's key suppliers are also based in Europe. A number of crucial German firms, for example, that are fundamentally important. So I wonder if there's a way that Europe ought to be thinking as well, is how do you bolster and solidify this position, not only ASML's position, but the broader role of Europe in the equipment industry?
You would think that this is a natural question for European policymakers, but actually very little attention on the fact that we should sustain our strength in manufacturing and packaging equipment, right? Like you said, it's not just, of course, ASML is the obvious elephant in the room and the most dominant company, but we have Aixtron, we have ASM International, we have Sysmicro. There are several European equipment companies, and speaking as a German here, it fits better to Europe's industrial base, where mechanical engineering and kind of process knowledge is simply deeply embedded in our university. It makes sense that let's say a European supplier network, I think 60% of the 5,000 suppliers of ASML are European companies. So it makes sense that a highly sophisticated mechanical equipment, where it's about precision in manufacturing steel and lenses and lasers and whatever, that this comes out of Europe, because historically speaking, this has been a strength of European manufacturing. And in the same sense, it's also not surprising to me that a lot of equipment companies sit in Japan, because also historically speaking, Japan has a lot of mechanical engineers and a very strong industrial base in that area. So why not play to your strength?
My favorite story here is the example of Zeiss, which makes the lenses for ASML's lithography, which was founded almost 200 years ago now and had this incredible history of being split into, well, first off, basically destroyed during the Soviet occupation of Germany, then split in two between an East German and West German version during the Cold War, with both sides in constant litigation as to who was the proper Zeiss. And nevertheless, it survived all this to still remain the best in the world. It's an incredible case study in path dependency in manufacturing.
Absolutely. And I think path dependency is something that is often downplayed, I think, at least in European policymaking. I'm wondering how it is in the US, because at least with semiconductor industrial policy, the idea is really that you can basically skip several nodes and jump ahead immediately to 2 nanometers. And just give us 5 years time, and at the end of this, at least following Europe's 10-year strategy from the European Commission, that by that time we will also have a cutting-edge wafer fabrication in Europe. And it completely ignores the fact of path dependencies. TSMC and Samsung are simply in the best position right now because of path dependencies to develop the next cutting edge. And in fact, TSMC just announced that they might have had a breakthrough research success for the 1 nanometer node. And I think that this is simply...
which they got to say 2 weeks after IBM was bragging about their 2 nanometer, just to rub it in their faces.
Fair enough. But you get my point. I think, especially for policy making, you should never underestimate path dependencies.
One of the factors that I think causes this path dependency is workforce issues, because you've got workers that are trained over time and then train the next generation. And it seems like that's something that Taiwan has managed to do extraordinarily well, build a cadre of people and have universities directly plugged into the education system that's leading people to TSMC and the other producers there. And I know, Jordan, you've done a bit of look into this in the U.S. case, but Maybe it'd be interesting to hear both in US and in Europe, what are the challenges that the semiconductor workforce faces?
Fundamentally, I think the issue over the past 25, 30 years has been that if you're engineering minded, you can have a much stable and likely more lucrative career doing software engineering as opposed to hardware engineering. Coming out of college, the Googles and Facebooks of the world will literally pay you twice as much as what you could get if you were working at an Intel or a Global Foundries. And this was not necessarily the case in the heyday of Silicon Valley, but coming back to like national strengths on the one hand, like it's not bad for people to sort themselves into the places in their economy where they can create the most GDP or what have you. But the issues are when you hollow a workforce out enough that you leave like national gains on the table and also open up vulnerabilities of the sort that we saw really manifest over the course of 2020, where the kind of lack of manufacturing capacity and know-how was really made apparent in America's struggles to deal with PPE and what have you. Though, of course, with vaccine manufacturing, that's a whole nother story because that career path has been something which has like remained lucrative, and there have been like very healthy world-beating companies over the past few decades that have thrived and not lost their workforces out to Twitter and Facebook. So in our piece, we talked about scholarships, which excitingly is something which has made it into an endless frontier. There's billions of dollars actually to subsidize STEM, and I think in particular sort of electrical and mechanical engineering. I want to come back to how to make money go further as opposed to just subsidizing fabs. Chris, can you tell the story of the origins of EDA tools and what lessons we can learn from that?
Yeah, it's a fun piece of history. And EDA today is a relatively small slice of the semiconductor supply chain in terms of the number of dollars that go to EDA companies, but it's impossible to make semiconductors without them. And in the earliest days of the industry, most chip firms had very basic EDA tools that they used in-house. So there weren't firms that did it on their own. It was every company, or at least the big companies, had their own internal models. But over the final years of the 1970s and into the early 1990s, DARPA and the National Science Foundation in the US began to give out really pretty small grants in the hundreds of thousands or a couple $1 million ranges, nothing big in comparison to the types of money the US government normally spends, to a couple of universities, Carnegie Mellon and Berkeley, chief among them, to create centers of excellence in computer-aided design, as it was then called, CAD. And out of these pretty small investments were born a series of different EDA companies, which eventually consolidated into the three biggest ones, Cadence, Synopsys, and Mentor, that we have today. As return on investment goes in terms of government spending, it's got to be the best bet that the U.S. government has ever made, both because these are three important companies economically, but also because if you want to control the global semiconductor supply chain for your foreign policy purposes, these are three pretty excellent kill switches that the U.S. has used against a number of Chinese companies. And so when I think about what's the best way for the government to spend money, I look at this as a case study of government spending gone very right, that you were able to take a small amount of money, run it through just two universities, basically a couple of faculty members. The number of people that were involved in this origin story is counted really in the dozens, and yet they've managed to create these world-beating companies that are almost impossible to replicate. And so I think the question we have to be asking is, how do we do that? What's the right way to replicate that success?
That story and case study, because recently I stumbled over DARPA's Toolbox initiative. Maybe you've seen or heard of it. And basically what DARPA says is, for their own researchers and contractors, it's so frustrating to negotiate license agreements with semiconductor IP vendors and also with EDA tool vendors. And it's such a high price point, and it is so much overhead that eats away time from the researcher actually doing what they do best, doing research, that the Toolbox initiative from DARPA is basically a collaboration with semiconductor IP vendors, where DARPA already negotiated all the important stuff out of the way, and it simply streamlines the process for the researcher to access all that semiconductor IP. And for me, this is a straightforward, pragmatic approach to lower the barrier for everybody. Of course, they talk about democratizing chip design, but streamlining the process and thus making it more accessible for everybody to simply innovate on chips.
Yeah, and the big question, I guess, certainly being asked in the US, but probably more broadly, is we've got these case studies of success like DARPA. What type of institutions is it that can replicate that success? I think part of the explanation in the US is that because DARPA is in the Defense Department and the Defense Department gets its appropriations approved much more easily through Congress than any other part of the government, no one asks very many questions. And so as long as they hire good people, it's easier for them to take big risks and not suffer if some of their risks don't pay off. But it can't be the whole part of the story. Jordan, I know you've been tweeting laments about changes in the legislation coming through Congress about ways that they've stripped out technology funding. What do you think?
So I've talked about this a little bit on other shows, so I don't want to go too far in depth. But what I will say is that even though the kind of civilian spending has been cut dramatically from what the initial tech directorate was proposing, there is money authorized for a microelectronics lab. And it still remains to be seen if that money is going to be realized and if it's going to be run in a smart way, which kind of builds on the success of the DARPA sandbox and turns it into something which is really scalable and actually allows more startups and more like hungry grad students with clever ideas to work on world-class equipment, see silicon and actually figure out how far their sort of lab breakthroughs are from turning things into actual products. So I am actually cautiously optimistic, at least on the chip side, that there are some interesting novel things in the new Competition Act, which is currently winding its way through the Senate, that are reminiscent, if not word for word, out of our Labs Over Fabs piece.
Well, yeah, and the idea of this quote-unquote democratization of the ability to do research that JP mentioned, I think is really important. And there's a number of examples of this in the history of the industry. I think back to I think it was the early 1980s when DARPA funded the first Fabs service it was called MOSIS. And this is before Fabs before foundries really existed. And so you had to know someone at Intel or know someone at National Semiconductor if you were a university research, to actually get chips made. And so DARPA funded this thing called MOSIS, which would let you use the ARPANET, the early internet, to send in your design, and they would find spare capacity at different fabs in Silicon Valley. And if you had a couple batches of wafers you wanted produced, they would find you a slot. And I think this is actually pretty important because it made it possible for people at universities to design and then have produced their own chips in a way that would have never been possible to do if there wasn't a service like this.
What is IMEC and why does it matter?
IMEC is one of the most important research and technology organizations in Europe for the semiconductor space. So what IMEC is doing is basically they're doing contract research together with their clients, and their clients are companies such as TSMC or Samsung or Intel or ASML. And they are really at the forefront of the process technology to advance the cutting edge. So if TSMC wants to develop the 1 nanometer node or the 2 nanometer node or whatever, typically what's happening is they do that in collaboration with. And interestingly, as often with European research, IMEC started out as partly publicly funded research organization. Of course, now, at least my understanding is that the majority of their research is commissioned by private companies and it's contract based. But there again, you have this element, what you mentioned before, Chris, public investments in R&D were a catalyst for broader innovation across the entire value chain. There are other relevant RTOs specifically for semiconductors in Europe, such as CEA-Leti in France and Fraunhofer in Germany. And interestingly, if we look at the kind of average R&D power, so to speak, of the different regions, Europe is really boxing above its price tag. So even though we have a minuscule share of the entire value chain in terms of sales, we are around 8 or 9% of global IC sales, European companies, the European research contribution is actually significantly higher, around 20%. And this is partly because of the importance of the European research and technology organizations to collaborate with US companies, with Taiwanese companies, with Chinese companies to advance semiconductor research. So for me, this again speaks to the really division of labor across the entire value chain. And it's what you mentioned before, Chris, with EDA and export restrictions, that it's really indispensable to develop modern chips. You can make that case for many other parts of the value chain, where if you take out this one piece, be that the ASML EUV lithography machine or the Japanese photoresist or the Taiwanese fab, everything breaks down. So how can we make this value chain more resilient and keep it global?
That's the big question, especially since I think everyone wants their piece to be more resilient, but
Yeah.
not necessarily everyone else's pieces to be more
exactly.
Yeah, it's just adding up when every country is like, yeah, we're going to get 20% market share by 2030. It's no, those like there's only one pie of 100%.
Exactly.
Someone's going to lose. I love that line, JP, in your report where you were like, in 2018, the European Commission again planned to strengthen the EU's chip design ecosystem through a European Design Alliance and strategic design initiatives. Instead, the EU's fabless factory shrunk by 50% over the last 10 years.
Yes.
So, easier said than done. It's one thing to say, we're going to spend all this money and we're going to win back the future. This is something that China is running into as well, right? Like with the Made in China 2025 saying we're going to do 70% of all of our chip consumption by 2025, produce it domestically. Like they're going to miss that by, I think it's going to be something like 25%. IC Insight's projection.
Yeah.
Very much easier said than done, riding against the trying to bend the path dependencies and sort of market realities. Though I think it's not completely unrealistic that over a longer time horizon, investing in education as well as the sort of resources for those people who are getting the PhDs to have the venture ecosystems and the tools to be able to start and compete and grow in a smart way. It's not impossible, but this is just really difficult stuff to bend. It's one thing for the US to cut firms off from technologies, right? That's the easy part. The hard part is like making sure that the new companies that start in your country get new customers and are able to compete with the established players.
What do you guys think of the recent announcement talking about more collaboration across the value chain that South Korea and the US government, to my understanding, have this memorandum of understanding where they want to strategically invest in the semiconductor ecosystem? What are your thoughts on this? Have you heard anything more about it? Because it sounded really interesting in terms of a more collaborative approach instead of reshoring and strategic autonomy and all of that.
So in this announcement, the readout was that the U.S. and the Republic of Korea will facilitate mutual and complementary investments in semiconductors, including for advanced and auto grade, encourage joint R&D. The line that I thought was most revealing was explore the creation of a U.S.-Korea supply chain task force between the White House and the Korean office of the president. I think this just goes to show that this is really tricky, pushing firms to do things that they wouldn't be doing otherwise. These sorts of business relationships and entrusting your company or your R&D into not only another firm, but another firm halfway across the world needs to have, I think, both business logic as well as personal relationships to be able to do these sorts of things. Given that lots of Koreans who are leading these companies have spent time in the US, have worked in American firms, have been to American research institutions or what have you. Those are the things that like take 20 years to build, and it's very difficult for democratic countries to force their firms to say, okay, like you guys all partner with Korea, don't partner with China anymore. And you can do that, but like this is you want to have it be natural and be an outgrowth of business logic as opposed to something where these firms say, oh, I guess the president is saying we should do this, so maybe we'll take an extra meeting or whatever you. And that sort of thing, it's not unhelpful. And clearly all these business leaders are getting the message. America is not China in that if a company doesn't do what the president wants, Biden can throw the CEO in jail. Or when you hear stories of Chinese firms not really wanting to do an investment in Belt and Road, and then they get the call from their state bank, which is their only source of lending, and they say, no, you're doing this project in northern Pakistan. And they say, okay, I guess we're doing this project in northern Pakistan. That level of leverage is not something that the U.S. has. What the U.S. can do is the U.S. government can do things like change procurement rules for the federal government to say, we will welcome joint Korea-U.S. collaborations and what have you. And maybe like NSF funding can be more oriented toward U.S.-Korean collaboration, that sort of thing. But this is a big boat, and the tools which are available to the U.S. government are slightly different when you want to realize these tech partnerships and do this sort of like international technology outreach than what would you do if you were, say, sitting in Beijing. And again, this is not to say that this stuff isn't important, but it is an extra degree of difficulty in making these kind of partnerships, which we also saw announced in the US-Japan context, make sense. The one thing which I will say complicates all of this is Congress's push to buy American. And I read through the 100-page summary of the Competition Act last night. I'll get through the 1,000-page full-text version at some point, I promise. I guess that's my Memorial Day weekend reading. Oh, my
Jesus.
God. But anyways, on the one hand, there are all these statements where it's like, it is the sense of Congress that it's really great and like Korea's really cool and Japan's really cool and we should collaborate with them on technology. But there's also 200 pages about buy American this and buy American that. And talking about putting your money where your mouth is, if you're not going to buy stuff from South Korea and Japan, even though these are the countries that you're most comfortable with and most excited to collaborate with on a technological basis, then it's going to be really hard, right? To push firms which are maybe a little wary to take the next step. One last thing on this is one of the challenges, I was talking to someone who works on US-Japan tech collaboration, is that the Japanese academic system is not synced up with the West's. So it's very difficult to do a sort of year-long fellowship or study abroad because they graduate in April and basically you have to take like an extra 6 months off if you want to be in an academic calendar in Japan and then go to the US for a little while. So there are, aside from these like big top-down, like, okay, let's make sure we allocate this money to that thing, there are also smaller people-to-people things because, again, these collaborations happen because folks hang out in grad school and play basketball and cook meals and watch the Super Bowl together, or sumo wrestling or what have you. Those sorts of things are also what you need, not just heads of state saying, "Hey, this is a good idea. Like, you guys play nicer together."
Well, I think we all agree that sumo wrestling is definitely crucial to the future of the semiconductor supply chain. But I agree with what you said, Jordan, but I think there's a distinction to be made between sort of U.S.-Japan and U.S.-Korea. And I think it has to do with the specific firms at play. So if you think of what kind of chips is South Korea producing at scale, we're talking about DRAM and NAND chips where there's direct competition with the U.S. firm Micron. And then South Korea's foundry activities Samsung's foundry activities are smaller, and a lot of it happens in Texas. So there is a bit of a zero-sum nature of U.S.-South Korea semiconductor investment, at least as it relates to the memory space. And there's a lot of state subsidization coming from both sides in a way that U.S.-Japan, I think, is different. There was a lot of accusations in the 1980s, but now actually the two countries are really complementary rather than competitive in what they produce, with a couple of exceptions. But it seems like there's actually a lot more space now for the U.S.-Japan, and I think Europe as well with the U.S. Again, there's not a whole lot of head-on competition. There's a lot more complementarity than with Korea. So in some ways, Korea seems like the toughest nut to crack if you were trying to get a joint R&D partnership up with an ally or something along those lines.
If you imagine there's a bilateral task force on semiconductor supply chain between South Korea and the US, at the end of the day, to make this task force work, you have to have an understanding of the actual supply chain. So companies need to let their pants down and say, look, this is what we are highly dependent on. A little bit what happened with the BIS call now for the vulnerabilities in the manufacturing and packaging supply chain. But of course, this was all on the record. So in between the lines, you read a little bit of information where the dependencies lies. But in such a task force, I cannot imagine that a US and South Korean competitor tell each other, oh, these are actually our vulnerabilities and we have no idea how to fix it in the long term. And if anybody would pull the plug, we would be screwed. I don't see that happening in any bilateral task force, to be honest.
JP, I'm really glad you read that stuff because honestly, I thought I was the only one. Those BIS submissions.
They are
really
super interesting.
Super interesting. I'll put a link in the show notes. But yeah, no, basically it was these firms telling the Commerce Department, hey, look, tungsten, it's a fucking problem. We got to get our hands on some tungsten. Chris, helium, huge Russian players, like 60% of the world's helium comes from Russia. And don't know how that happened, but
there's also, I never knew that there's a helium reserve in the US, and there's something interesting going on that
But JP, they're canceling it because they were trying to save money. They sold it like exactly the wrong time. And it was like the biggest, these reserves are very tricky, but like Congress basically did the opposite of what they should have done.
Beautiful.
And now they're going to have to like turn it back on, which is going to be twice as expensive as had they never turned it off in the first place. So.
Just last shout out to I never thought I would say this, but last shout out to the BIS call for request. there's a small US company that handed in like a 3 or 5 pager, and you can see there are spelling errors. And at the end of the thing, they even say, sorry, we have done this quite quickly. If you want to know more, please hit us up. But it's a PCB manufacturer. And they make the wonderful point where they say, look, you're worried about your manufacturing base. You're also worried about your advanced packaging base. What at the end of the day, all this stuff comes together at a PCB, and we don't have any capacity for that within the United States. This is all outsourced.
JP, what is PCB?
It's a printed circuit board. So basically, if you think of your main board in your computer, the blue or green base where all the components sit on, that's the PCB. So it's really the last step where Foxconn workers like solder everything on top. But it's also super easy to exploit the PCB to compromise a device. So there's a huge national security dimension. It's completely outsourced because it's way too labor intensive. It's considered low tech by chip design standards because it's just a PCB. But this small company makes a wonderful argument that says, basically, it's nice that you think about all the previous production steps, but if it's about national security and resilience, you shouldn't forget about this last part, even though it's not sexy.
I thought the Foxconn submission was pretty underwhelming too. It's you guys basically have promised this plant which now no longer exists, and now you're telling America what to do, and you have spelling mistakes. Like, oh,
it's awkward for everybody
involved. You're
involved.
like a multi-billion-dollar company. I'm sorry, no excuses. Chris Miller, JP, thanks so much for coming on China Talk.
Thanks so much, Jordan.
24 hour 我不休息，我帮我的家人，我帮我的兄弟，我帮我的梦想不休息。舒服的感觉跟弱者，我要证明他们全部都是错的。不是野兽 ，Let's go， 做事保持警惕，我的总是我的，我不能休息。24 hour 我不休息，我帮我的家人，我帮我的兄弟，我帮我的梦想不休息。舒服的感觉跟弱者，我要证明他们全部都是错的。不是野兽 ，Let's go， 做事保持警惕，我的总是我的。他们想比me down， 但是太困难。 我活的每天都像在过新年，像过圣诞。每一次受伤后都会变更强，我血液变滚烫。我把我城市背在我身上，无论怎样传来了声浪。天哪里 catch run for my safety， 我不对累积。扣满主人盯着新的脸，只要闪得出水滴。对比，不要再让你们哄我做对比。我做的每一个动作都闪耀像流星的轨迹。Same shit different day， 嘻哈地会被我捡起。 我过得越来越富裕，越会让我想起曾经的点滴。曾经我除了我自己，Nobody trust me。现在我家喻户晓，看上了白色的法拉利 flexing， 我不用休息。24 hour 我不休息，我帮我的家人，我帮我的兄弟，我帮我的梦想不休息。舒服的感觉跟弱者，我要证明他们全部都是错的。我是野兽 ，Let's go， 总是保持警惕，我的总是我的，我不用休息。24 hour 我不休息。 我帮我的家人，我帮我的兄弟，我帮我的梦想不休息。舒服的感觉跟弱者，我要证明他们全部都是错的。我是野兽 ，Let's go， 总是保持警惕，我的总是我的。随便穿件白 T， 我也能像奢侈品一样非常的高级。晚上我都不需要结束，拉一拉手刹就可以飘跌。现在手机我把钱可借，放进我的本不会爆裂。所有新有的好儿童除了几何落，等我开始摇起。我不是搞起耍的，少跟我整那些假的。花发挣的钱不是抢的，我才不得管你们到底咋个想的。我和我兄弟伙最吵，夜里面我们最会聊。碰到时间凌晨4点，偏到成都，我们两个对标。骑着车油门踩起融融，东京那像是有恐龙。眼睁睁的看到我们走红，我晓得天上我才那就必定有用。他们只看到我外表的光线，忽略了我有的经历，回到改变你的经济，这一切来之不易。我必须要捍卫我领地，我不能休息。24 hour 我不休息。 我帮我的家人，我帮我的兄弟，我帮我的梦想不休息。舒服的感觉跟弱者，我要证明他们全部都是错的。我是野兽 ，Let's go， 做事保持警惕，我的总是我的，我不用休息。24 hour 我不休息。我帮我的家人，我帮我的兄弟，我帮我的梦想不休息。舒服的感觉跟弱者，我要证明他们全部都是错的。我是野兽 ，Let's go， 做事保持警惕，我的总是我的。我不会往下，明知山有虎，我偏向虎山行。就让暴风雨再来猛烈点，别留情。向着日出的方向不断前进。 一柔克刚，四连拨前进。嘿，前面在燃烧，破晓。他们不相信，说我做不到。嘿，前面在燃烧，破晓。点亮这座城市，点亮眼里的目标。反抗，为了家人还有兄弟。想要整个夏天，努力整个冬季。歌曲不一样，我把你们当空气。男子汉大丈夫要做的惊天动地。红色血液沸腾，我站在紫禁之巅。月光下决战，把我说的话实现。如果你不理解，再多给你点时间。我也想要看看自己真正的极限。Who you are, put it on your block。炎黄子孙弄的传染黄皮肤的 superstar， 我中国人，我的意志力就像万里长城在上升。面对不公平的条约，在抗争都站起来。新的世界，新的秩序，在洗牌城墙内外留下足迹，会被历史给记载，全都没问题。没有什么门槛是我过不去 ，Cause I believe。听我站在紫禁之巅，说着我不会往下。名字上有虎，我偏向虎山行。就让暴风雨再来猛烈点，别留情。向着日出的方向不断前进。一柔克刚，四两拨前进。嘿，前面在燃烧，破晓。他们不相信，说我做不到。嘿，前面在燃烧，破晓。点亮这座城市，点亮眼里的目标。Come on。可以坐下来聊下天吗？他们的 CD 带习惯吗？许过的愿望全都实现了。你觉得你自己有没有变呢？受不了别人在说你的坏话。你觉得你付出了足够的代价？不同的女人的香水，马屁印在你的周围，回到了家里面一个人的时候，是否会害怕？你是否怀念你小时候，伴随日落约好朋友们在楼顶吹风？追女孩比做数学题还困难，像笨蛋，从不为未来担心，因为你知道你根本没有任何胜算。我在那个时候选中了你，闯入你的生活，带你去了新世界里。那是我第一次介绍我的名字给你 ，HIP HOP。Hip Hop saved my life。Hip Hop saved my life. Yeah. Hip Hop saved my life. Come on. Hip Hop saved my life. 都给我闭嘴！我知道应该怎么做的。我过的生活是我做梦都想过的。还记得我出了地铁站就是个跑车店，我站在门口幻想有一天能开到灰皮线。我曾经不吃午饭为了一本漫画书，我想要实现愿望找到我的七龙珠。在学校里面是个异类，没地位，在篮球校队是个替补，没有上场机会。直到了有一天你出现在我世界，我开始意识到和这些人的区别。我拒绝和他们过一样的生活，我说拒绝。我张开翅膀就没想过落地，哪怕精疲力竭，也让我大胆崇拜，别害怕，不要退后。你永远在我背后，你会陪我走到最后。你是个秘密，赋予我生命特殊意义。HIP HOP Hip Hop saved my life. Hip Hop saved my life. True that. Hip Hop saved my life.Yes, come on. Hip Hop saved my life. 万个观众等我们上场，来把手叠在一起，我们做到了。我背着一书包先进去买车，后视镜的自己像是废皮森一样的笑着。给我支笔，我甚至都不需要纸，就能够写出来完美的歌词。现在的家人的希望，朋友的梦想，像是在天空中飞翔的鸽子，和当年的我一样的幼稚，一样的斗志，明明的斗志，绝不会大家去，因为我是一个斗士。更多目光只会让我更强，我不想睡 ，on my way 变得更忙。这是我曾无数次梦到的灯光，打在我的身上。我和他一起经历太多，他爱我，他是我身体里跳动的脉搏。这首是关于我跟他的友谊 ，HIP HOP。 goes like hey, hip hop saved my life. Yeah, come on, hip hop saved my life. Yeah, yeah, hip hop saved my life. True that, come on, hip hop saved my life.